Matthias. Welcome to Castle Otttis. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Everybody's having a good day so far. So if you have any questions at any time, feel free to ask me, and you're welcome to take pictures and videos as well. So Castle Otttis was created as an original landscape sculpture, and it was built in remembrance of Jesus Christ. The landscape sculpture is defined as a sculpture built to adorn the landscape. So sure enough, Castle Otttis, it lends its beauty to the landscape around it. And at the same time, the landscape, it lends its beauty to the sculpture. So it's a symbiotic relationship between the two, the landscape and the sculpture. That's why we call this a landscape sculpture. Another example of a landscape sculpture is the Eiffel Tower. It is also a sculpture built to adorn the landscape. It's just different form and different material. So with that being said, Castle Otttis was never intended to be a home, nor a business, nor a tourist attraction. It was built to be an expression of art, built in remembrance of Jesus Christ, and to be a place of peace upon this earth. Every single block to this castle was laid by just two individuals. And the names of these two individuals are Rusty and Otttis. Rusty's my dad, who I love very much, and who I'm most proud of. And Otttis was my dad's friend. And so my dad and Otttis, they physically laid every single block of this building by themselves without the aid of laborers or helpers. It was just those two men who laid every single block. They mixed up all the mortar on site by themselves. They set up all the scaffolding, and so on and so forth. That process took about 4 years, from 1984 to 1988. And so May 1st, 1984 is when they laid the head cornerstone, 42 years ago. And then in the summer of 1988, that's when they felt a sense of completeness to the concrete portion of the building. And in the years afterwards, they built the wall that wraps around the castle. And what my dad would always tell people about that wall is that they wanted to avoid clearing the trees around the castle. And so they weaved the wall in and out of the woods in a serpentine pattern. And he would mention that the serpentine pattern, it gives the wall great stability, as opposed to a straight wall, which is a lot more likely to fall over. The curves of that wall gives great stability. And so when they were building Castle Otttis, there was no models, there was no sketches, there was no elevation drawings. It was all straight and built. And as the building took on its free form, my dad, Otttis, and many people, they remarked how the building seemed to give off the impression of an Irish castle from over 1,000 years ago. So that's what we believe it to be. He would always tell people that the building seemed to insist its own will be created. So all of the material you're looking at is split-faced concrete block. And so I love saying that word, split-faced concrete block. It's a mouthful. It's funny. And so what it really means is that at the block yard, where they create these individual pieces of block, they take a machine and they split the face of the block with that machine. And so when they're splitting the face of it, a piece pops off the outside of it, and every time they do that, it leaves the face of it with a unique appearance. It's random every time they do it. No block is identical due to the randomness of how they split the face of the block. So that's why they call it split-face concrete block. Each one weighs about 40 pounds on average, and it's very common material used to build homes and commercial buildings. The gas station right down the road is made out of that same material. It's just typically they would apply some kind of weatherproofing membrane to the outside of it, some kind of sealant. But they didn't do that for this building because it's built to be open to the elements anyways, so they weren't concerned with moisture entering those porous blocks. And it's very popular for buildings, for the outside of a building, because the split-face texture is very attractive to the exterior of the building, as opposed to a boring, flat wall. The split-face texture, it gives the wall a lot of character. The coolest thing about every single block of this building is that every single block was donated from local construction companies that had leftover material from their job sites. So my dad, Rusty, and his friend Otttis, they were both construction workers. They were block masons. And the companies they worked for, they heard about what they were doing. They were building a monument to glorify Jesus. And so these companies, they started to reach out to my dad whenever they completed a local job site. They would call my dad, and my dad would go over to those job sites in his pickup truck, and he would load the leftover block in the bed of his pickup truck and bring it back over here and stage it around the castle. And I kid you not, that's how every single block of this castle arrived here, is on the bed of his personal civilian pickup truck.
Wow.
Wow. It was a labor of love for my dad, Rusty, and his friend Otttis, and a community project, because most of the material was donated. So, that's the material, and I can go, I can go a little bit deeper into the actual construction itself.
What about the foundation? What do they have to do?
Foundations. So, you have a concrete footer underneath the first course block, but luckily, very fortunately, there's a giant bed of coquina underneath the concrete footer. And if you're not familiar with coquina, it's a natural substance, material, that is formed underneath the earth over the course of millions of years. Basically, a bunch of seashells, they become bonded to each other and it creates a rock-like substance. And so they used to mine coquina out of this property. They would take it to St. Augustine and build homes there. This used to be a coquina quarry. And if you're familiar with the fort in downtown St. Augustine, Castillo de San Marcos, that entire fort is created out of that coquina. And so it's 12 feet high, by the way. The coquina, the bed of coquina that's underneath us is 12 feet high. It's about twice my height. So that is the main foundation for Castle Otttis. And in my opinion, it's probably the most important part of the castle, even if you can't see it.
They dug down through that.
Yeah, so they dug down to it, they poured a concrete footer right on it. So before they even laid the first block, they had an engineer come out here and took some soil samples. And that's when they found the bed of coquina. And that's when it occurred to my dad that this used to be a coquina quarry. Because when he bought this property in the 70s, he didn't buy it with the intention of building the castle. That idea came to him later on in a series of dreams. And in these dreams, he kept dreaming about a castle. And the dreams, they left him with an overwhelming sense of peace and comfort. So we told his friend Otttis about those dreams, and Ottis simply said, well, we could do that, just like that. And so sure enough, before they laid the first block, they took the soil samples, and that's when they found the bed of coquina. So like I said, my dad always felt like the building seemed to insist its own world be created. And in that word, Otttis is spelled O-T-T-I-S. The three T's are symbolic of the three crosses during the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So even in the name, there is symbolism. And so, I'll start with the tops of the towers. See how the pieces of concrete on the tops of the towers are going on different angles? Well, those pieces of concrete are called merlins. And the gaps between the merlins are the crenels. And so, they're very common in castles and forts. Archers, they would hide behind the merlins and they would shoot their arrows through the gaps or the crenels. But typically the merlins, they don't go on angles like that. They're usually just flush with the outer edge of the tower. And the reason they put them on angles like that is to symbolize the crown of thorns. So that's what the tops of the towers represent. Beautiful. And so on the same subject as the archers, we also have this for your consideration. That's known as an arrow slit window. And so archers, they would hide behind the walls and they would shoot their arrows out of the slits of the windows. But you see how the angles of the windows are facing you like this?
Yeah.
Typically they would be the other way around. And that makes sense, right? Because then the archer can use his bow against the angles of those windows. But my dad Rusty and his friend Otttis, they inverted the angles to symbolize a place of peace rather than a place of trouble. So there's also something. The angles are called splays, by the way. You have some Roman windows or Roman arches. You have some Celtic crosses installed in the Roman arches. The ring around the cross is called a nimbus. It represents the sun as well as God's eternal love. So that's just some of the beautiful architecture we can see on this side of the building. And you have a couple of different examples. So very early on, basically what's happening when coquina forms is that when it rains, the rainwater carries carbon dioxide down into the soil and it saturates the bed of seashells. And the carbon dioxide actually starts to dissolve the seashells and a substance comes off the seashells. It's called calcite, and it's basically nature's glue. And so when the bed of seashells dries up, the calcite, it bonds the seashells to each other. And that's how they get stuck to each other. And you repeat that process millions of times over millions of years, the seashells, they dissolve more and more and more, and they become more rock-like, harder and harder and harder. And so this is good building material. That is the foundation that's underneath Castle Otttis. We're talking about 12 feet high with this rock-like substance. And so that's the most important part of the castle, in my opinion. They call it coquina because the main seashell that it's comprised of comes from a clam called the coquina clam. And it looks like this guy right here. I'm trying to find a better sample. Like this. So that's the half shell of the coquina. So, like the calcite that bonds the seashells to each other, the mortar is what bonds the blocks to each other, the concrete to each other. And so you wouldn't typically see the mortar applied in such a fashion. What you would typically see is what we see on the inside of this planter. If you want to get a closer look, I'll point it out on this side. See the joints in the block right here? How clean they look, how smooth they look. That's what you typically see in a block wall. No matter the face of the block is smooth like that or split like this, they would do a process and it's called slicking the joints. They take a tool, it's called a joiner, it looks like a butter knife, and they compress the mortar in there and it makes a nice clean line. And so, my dad and Otttis, they came up with a very interesting idea. After they slicked the joints, they took a little bit of extra mortar on their trowel and then they smeared it over the joints like that, like they were icing a cake. The goal for them was to blend the block into each other, almost give it the appearance that it's made out of stone as opposed to individual blocks. So this was done about 2005, and my dad built it to represent what's known as a beehive hut. So in Ireland, thousands of years ago, this is literally what people lived in. We call it a beehive hut. It's not because there's bees in there, but because the structure looks like a beehive. And so if you go to Ireland, to this day, there's still beehive huts all over the land, and you can go visit them like tourist attractions. So that's what that is, beehive hut. 3 windows in the middle of the castle. Those are some more Gothic windows. I like to call them the Trinity windows, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Every single window is built to be open to the elements. They were never intended to have glass in them. Because again, this is the landscape sculpture. It's a sculpture built to adorn the landscape, but also to be one with the landscape and one with Mother Nature and everything Mother Nature has to offer us. If you count all the windows, you'll find that there's 88 windows to this building. Yes, even if you count that bricked up window, I include that in my count. So what my dad would always tell people is that 88 is the same amount of keys you would find on a piano. Just a way to help people remember. About 15 years ago, and it took place during a military wedding that we had, and the bride and groom and some of the members of the U.S. Marine Corps, they were, they just got out of combat, and so together they made this heart as a way to honor all members of the military. And after they finished the heart, the chaplain led them to receive some prayers, and then he blessed the heart for them. So we call it the heart of the castle, and it's to honor all members of the military. You're welcome to sit if you would like. So, as I mentioned outside, all of the block was laid from 1984 to 1988 by Rusty and Otttis. As they were laying it, as we know, many people came by to visit. And one of those people, his name is Lee Carpenter. And I'm sure you can tell where I'm going with this story. So Lee Carpenter, he's the guy who crafted all this woodworking here by himself. And so when he came by and visited while the block was being laid, he was just coming to check it out. He had no intention of wanting to build a church from it. And so he came over and he quickly became very good friends with my dad and Otttis. And he would just keep coming over and hanging out with them while they were laying the block. And so after the block work was completed, my dad actually asked Lee, because he had saw some examples of his work, my dad actually asked Lee if he could build a church on it. And Lee said, definitely. He was so touched by the beauty of the structure and by the meaning behind it that he wanted to participate as well. So over the course of 3 years, 1988 to 1991, lead carpenter. He crafted all this woodwork by himself, and he had guidance from local historians to evoke the atmosphere of an Irish abbey from over 1,000 years ago. Construction. Other examples are log cabins and barns, so that was lead carpenter's specialty. Most of the wood in here is swamp cypress, and they call it swamp cypress because it grows out of the swamps and the wetlands. And so these trees, they spend their lives growing out of the water, and they develop a natural. Then across the roots, the pulpit. Pulpit represents the Word of God, it represents the Bible, because that's where the pastor speaks from. And then the last thing that completes this church are the very pews that the congregation will sit on. And yeah, there's a nice baptismal font over there as well. So there's another thing that we have. We bring that out sometimes when we do the baptisms.
So you do have church services here?
Yes, so shortly after 1991, my dad's friend, he started to officiate the worship services. His name is Marvel, and his wife, Pompey, is the keyboardist. We actually have a picture of him downstairs. The Judeans or the Jews, and so that is where the Jewish religion came from. And so when Jesus was born, he was known as the conquering Lion of Judah. So it's the only painted image in this building, and it represents the strength of Jesus, his victorious power over all evil. Going to arise to this world and bring healing in his wings. And he's going to bless each and every one of us. And that's essentially what happened. Jesus came to this world and he rose as the Son of Righteousness. He brought healing in his wings and he blessed each and every one of us.